engage in political philosophy, particularly in lots of political philosophy, in Western moral and political thought. So the basic idea, right, of social contract theory is that society is to be understood as a contract or an agreement between individuals. So notice the setup there is you're an individual first, member of society second, right? So we'll look at two different versions, again, of social contract theory. One that's more authoritarian and one that's more of a classical liberalism style. So when I use classical liberalism there, I don't mean like the center left and all the way to the far left of the political spectrum. I mean a type of government in which you might have both conservatives and lowercase liberals, right?
In the reading you had
Communitarianism. Well, it's still going to be probably social contract theory, but there the communitarians pretty much think that you are a social animal before you enter society. So that's one of the big differences there. They also will probably be more focused on common goods or public goods rather than individual rights. So again, classical liberalism, you get the rise of modernity, right? You get the French Revolution, people wanting more individual liberty, and you also have the rise of modern authoritarian regimes at the same time. Right? So different ways of thinking about the social contract then. So to get us started, just to recall something we covered earlier in this semester, why be moral from Plato? We had that problem of moral motivation. Another way of asking this is, why should I obey the law? What are my obligations to obey, or the extent of my obligation to obey political authority, whether it's the law or the figurehead or the legislative body? So you see this contract theory pop up again, early on in Western thought, in Plato's Republic, where they're trying to figure out what the ideal society would be. So we talked about this when we covered practical moral skepticism. The perfectly just society is a society, according to Plato here, or rather Socrates, is a society in which each of the parts of the soul or the parts of society each play their role governed by reason, right? So Socrates posits this idea that there are basically three types of individuals. You're either more driven by reason, more driven by thumos or spiritedness or courage, or by your appetites and desires, right? And so the just individual is an individual with a well-ordered soul, and a well-ordered soul is one in which all parts of the soul play their respective role, but governed by reason, right? So corresponding to each type of soul, you have a kind of class of people or people in society. The craftsmen, they're primarily driven by eros, and so they focus on producing goods and services and satisfying people's desires, right? You've got a police and a police force and a military. Those are the guardians. Well, what character trait do you need if you're going to be a guardian or a police force? Courage, right? And then who should rule? Well, the wisest of them, so philosophers, they understand, they're driven primarily by logos. They understand not just the parts, but the whole, and so they're best suited to rule, according to Plato. Right? So again, you can think of political philosophy as being focused around kind of two questions. What's the point of politics? Is it social order? And what is justice? Is it social order, or is it like virtue? Right? So again, justice in the ideal society is each type playing their role governed by reason. So that's just society would look like in Plato. Then Aristotle, picking up on the idea that there are different types of government, makes a little typology or categorization of different types of government, and they're either good forms or virtuous forms. Remember Aristotle? So Aristotle comes down on the different side of that. The people who should rule, according to Aristotle, are the most virtuous, and society should be organized around the promotion of human flourishing, right? So the common good. So Aristotle's more like a communitarian thinker. You don't see individual rights popping up a lot in Nicomachean Ethics, but we see that in Locke and Rousseau. So different types. The virtuous types are the corrupt and vicious types. So you could have rule by one person. When you have a virtuous version of that, and the monarch governs with an eye not towards his own interests, his private interests, but the public interests, We got a kingsmanship or a monarchy. When rule by one is primarily focused around the satisfaction of the interest of the monarch themselves, then we have tyranny. So it's the vicious form of rule by one. We could have rule by the few. The virtuous form of that is aristocracy, again, where the few govern with an eye towards what is in the public good, not their private interest to their groups. But when you have rule by a few that is governing society or trying to govern society, not with regard to the public good and human flourishing, but around their own private interests, to advance their own private interests, we get an oligarchy. When you have rule by many, the virtuous form of that is a polity, but then according to Aristotle and Plato, or Socrates as well, that's democracy is the corrupt form of that. So they were critical of rule by the many. You get a different approach to that, different valuation of democracy when you get to the modern period, right? So again, corrupt versus incorrupt forms based on how many rulers, one, a few, a small group, or the many. You'll see those ideas, types of constitutions popping up again in some of the passages that I pull out from Hobbes and Locke here. So again, basic social contract theory. Society is a contract between individuals. So again, we're members of society second and individuals first. Social contract theory has three basic parts to it. The condition of human beings prior to the formation of society, that's called the state of nature. So that's it's like zombie land. There is no government. It's a free-for-all, right? So the state of nature. How you understand the state of nature is going to influence what justifications you think there are for entering in the contract and starting up a commonwealth, and will influence what kind of political authority follows or is required given the state of nature. If you think everything's in chaos and that you've got to worry about creating social order, you're going to have a strong political authority in order to produce that order. Right, so we'll have different views of the state of nature, the reasons for entering the Commonwealth, and political theory here between Hobbes and Locke. Again, Hobbes is kind of the more monarchical and dictator type. He talks about the sovereign's will is the basis of justice there, versus Locke and Rousseau, who thought that the state of nature was relatively cooperative. So you could leave people to their own devices and everything will be okay, right? Or mostly okay. Right? So we get Hobbes here. And then Hobbes versus Locke. So these passages come from the Leviathan, again, discussed in the reading for today a little bit, starting off by talking about the state of nature. And Hobbes holds a pessimistic view of the state of nature. He says that there are three principal causes of quarrel in it: competition, mistrust, and glory in the state of nature. So these are the three things that motivate people, but that lead them to have conflict with others. Then in the state of nature, again, the condition before human beings form a society, he says there is no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, in which is worst of all continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man is therefore solitary, poor,
and because the condition
nasty,
of man
brutish, and
is a
short.
condition of war of everyone against everyone, in which case everyone is governed by his own reason, and there is nothing he can make use of that may not be helped unto him in preserving his life against his enemies. It followeth that in such a condition every man has a right to everything, even to one another's body, and therefore, as long as this natural right of every man to everything.
Another famous
Thomas
line
Hobbes,
is that it's a condition
Leviathan.
of man is a war of all against all, or of everyone against everyone. So that's a pessimistic view of the state of nature. We're all in competition with each other. Hobbes was a psychological egoist, so he thinks that human beings are are only motivated to act in their own self-interest, right? To fulfill their own aims. So we're in the state of nature. It's chaotic, but you're rational and self-interested. What do you think you might want to do? And you want peace, right? You don't want to live. How many people want to live in continual fear of me coming and getting them? Right? Probably not, right? So we're going to make some agreements about how to treat each other, and now we've got a society, right? And then we get the institution of moral and political norms. But in a state of nature, you can do whatever you want to preserve your own life. So he says the right of nature, so natural rights or jus natural, is the liberty each man hath to use his own power as he will himself for the preservation of his own nature, that is to say his own life, and consequently do anything which in his own judgments and reason shall conceive to be the aptest means thereunto, to preserve his own life. So there is nothing morally or politically wrong or unjust in the state of nature, according to Hobbes. So again, you can do anything you want to preserve your own life. First law of nature is the law of self-preservation. And then, but we're in this war of all against all, bless you, but we're governed by our own reason, and there is nothing he can make use of that may not be upheld to him in preserving his life against his enemies. It followeth that such a condition, every man has a right to everything, even to one another's body. And therefore, as long as this nature of right of every man to everything. So again, there is no moral right and wrong in the state of nature. You only get that after you start to get these social agreements. So we give up our natural freedom. We're self-interested. We're rational. It's chaotic out here, and we live in continual fear of violent death. So let's start making some promises to each other. So consequently, it is the precept or general rule of reason that every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he can hope of obtaining it. And when he cannot obtain it, he may seek all and use helps and the advantages of war. So again, chaotic environment, fear of continual death. We're self-interested and rational. We're peace-seeking. It's easier to preserve yourself and your own life when you live in an orderly society rather than one that's chaotic. So therefore, we've got a selfish, self-interested reason for entering into the social contract. It's easier for me to preserve my own life if I have some agreements with people. So the transferring of that natural right for a political right is what we call a contract then. And justice is the constant will of giving to every man his own based on what we agreed to in that contract. I do this, you do that, we get this reward. You don't do that, you get this punishment. So it's kind of a coercive notion of the contract. You can see, think of those care ethicists who were criticizing the social contract on this point earlier in the semester. So justice is a matter of keeping valid covenants or contracts, and the sovereign gets to decide who is and isn't keeping the contract. So it's the sovereign's will or decree that is the basis of justice. He's got to keep social order is what his main job is. So we erect and form society for the sake of preserving our own lives. That requires a well-ordered society. So he divides up these different kinds of constitutions as well. He says you can have one person be the ruler or more be the ruler, a few. If more, then it is an assembly of all or but of a part, right? When the representative is one man, then the commonwealth is a monarchy. We saw that in Aristotle. When it's assembly of all that will come together, then it's a democracy or a popular commonwealth. Other kinds of commonwealth, there can be none, for either one or more or all must have the sovereign indivisible power. And Hobbes's view is to give it to one. He's got the English Civil War in the backdrop of his head, where he saw his own country descend into violent chaos, and so he kind of thinks look, we got a choice to make here. Either the potential to slide into utter violent chaos, which is undesirable, or a centralized authority with near absolute power to govern. Might worry about whether that's a false dichotomy. So on the government then, we got those three kinds of commonwealth, right? So he says, from whence it follows that where the public and private interest are most closely united, there is the public most advanced. Now in monarchy, the private interest is the same with the public. The riches, power, and honor of the monarch arise only from the riches, strength, and reputation of his subjects. For no king can be rich, nor glorious, nor secure, whose subjects are either poor or contemptible, or too weak to want, or through dissension to maintain a war against their enemies. Whereas in democracy or aristocracy, ruled by the many or ruled by the few, The public prosperity confers not so much to the private fortune of the one that is corrupt or ambitious, as doth many times the perfidious advice of treacherous action or a civil war. When people start acting just for their private interest, there's where we get the potential for chaos and civil war. So political obligation, legitimate political authority is what, so he says it's not wisdom. The philosopher kings aren't going to rule. The wisest, most virtuous person is not going to rule. The person with the power is going to be the ruler. So the obligation of subjects, that means our citizens, to the sovereign is understood to last as long and no longer than the power lasteth by which he is able to protect them. So once the sovereign stops acting to protect the well-ordered society and to protect the peace, which they can use, propaganda and all sorts of heavy-handed tactics to ensure that, but once they're failing at that job, that's the only reason we get to justifiably revolt against the sovereign. So that's why I say a near absolute authority. There is a little sliver of a justification for civil disobedience or revolution in Hobbes. Then we get to Locke. They talk about Rousseau and Locke as examples of classical liberalism in the reading. I'm just going to focus on Locke, mainly because he influenced, or is one of the ones that influenced the founding fathers of America so heavily in the Declaration of Independence. And in the U.S. Constitution, you can find ideas that are very Lockean sounding, and were read by the founding fathers before they came to America. So Locke, he wrote this book called Two Treatises on Government. In the first treatise, one of his big points is to criticize the divine right of kings. So we're going to get rid of kings, right? He's a modern enlightened thinker, right? Scientific revolution, French Revolution kind of ideas. Individual liberty is starting to come around as a central concept in political life. His view of the state of nature, right, is more optimistic than Hobbes's pessimistic, short, nasty, and brutish. In the state of nature, there is still he calls them inalienable rights. So rights that can't be taken away or transgressed without wrongdoing. And they adhere to individuals, right? So again, this idea that the individual is the bearer of rights is going to then limit what the government can do to us, right? So the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is at law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. The Declaration of Independence say about life, liberty, and happiness, right? Your right to pursue those things should not be abridged, right? Lockean idea right there. Not just Locke, but he's one of the main ones proposing this sort of, new types of government in the modern period. For men, being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, all servants of one master, sent into the world by his order, by his business, they are his property, whose workmanship they are, made to last during his and not another's pleasure, and being furnished with like faculties, sharing in all one community of nature, there cannot be supposed any such subordination of us, among us, that may authorize us to destroy one another, as if we were made for one another's uses. Again, kind of Kantian language sounding there. Also a proponent of classical liberalism, and not to quit his station willfully, so by that like reason, when his own preservation comes not into competition, he ought as much as he can to preserve the rest of mankind, and may not, unless it be to do justice on an offender, take away or impair the life, or what tends to the preservation of the life, liberty, health, limb, or goods of another. So we have a natural moral right, inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So from the jump, you're a free being, and that has to be respected according to Locke and folks like Kant and Rousseau. So first big difference, Hobbes, pessimistic, no such thing as right and wrong in the state of nature. Locke, relatively cooperative and moral rights. Because we're God's creatures, basically. So what's the aim of government? In Hobbes, it was maintenance of peaceful order, right? The aim of government, according to Locke, is the preservation of private property. He's got this famous thought experiment called Locke's apples and acorns. And we'll come back to this here. So, out in the wilderness, there are trees, and there's apple trees and acorn trees. And when I appropriate something from the commons, the public sphere where nothing belongs to any individual in particular, or a group of them, I take those natural resources, I mix my labor with it, and then I am entitled to the product of my mixing my labor with natural resources. It's mine. I mix my labor with it, so now I have private property over it. So he asked, when do the acorns and apples become mine? Personal property? Well, when you mix your labor with them. And so the government is supposed to protect the fruits of your labor, the protection of private property. So the great and chief end, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property, to which the state of nature there are many things wanting. First, there wants an established, settled, known law received and allowed by common consent to be the standard of right and wrong, and the common measure to decide all controversies between them. For though the law of nature be plain and intelligible to all rational creatures, yet men being biased in their own interest as well as ignorant for want of study of it, are not apt to allow of it as a law abiding to them in the application in their particular cases. So you might ask, this is the anarchist challenge. If everything's so good in the state of nature, why would I be motivated or have a reason to enter into the social contract? Well, Locke says that we still enter into the social contract because we get a common settled law, right? So we have official laws that we know, so we can know, and are public principles for our behavior. We get a set of independent judges to settle controversies, right? And then we get, a form of government that can enforce those decisions. Right? So we're not entering the contract to make it easier to survive, but for the protection of our property. It still makes it easier, but we get these other benefits for entering into it as well. So political authority then. The aim of government is the protection of private property. So when political authority stops presiding, fulfilling the will of the majority and protecting property, now we've got a justification for civil disobedience or maybe even revolt, according to Locke. So we get the sovereign, near absolute authority versus majority rule and popular sovereignty in Locke. So he says, but though men, when they enter into society, give up the equality, liberty, and executive power they had in the state of nature into the hands of society, to be so far disposed of the legislative as the good of the society shall require it, yet being only with an intention to everyone the better to preserve themselves, his liberty and his property. So it still is easier to preserve property in a society rather than in the state of nature. So we're still getting, benefits from it, even if they are not like the order that makes it possible for us to survive alone. So tyranny is what happens when you don't have majority rule. And in Locke, there is a deficiency because majority rule can turn out to be fairly authoritarian too. So you got to have a correction in Locke there as well. But tyranny is just the exercise of power beyond right, which nobody can have a right to. And this is making use of the power any one of us has in his hands, not for the good of those under it, but for his own private separate advantage. So when the government starts disregarding majority rule, it's not protecting the private property of individual citizens, but it's acting so as to do things for the good of a few people. Now we can engage in civil disobedience or revolt. So it justifies those things according to Locke. So justifiable revolt then. So civil disobedience, it's a relatively just society, but there are a few social policies that are unjust, so we need to draw attention to them and get those corrected to become a more perfect union, right? Revolt, the whole thing is corrupt, and we got to start over again. Right? So we got to return to the state of nature and start a different form of government. So whenever the legislators endeavored to take away and destroy the property of the people, or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people who were thereupon absolved any further obedience. So we have no political obligations anymore, and are left to the common refuge, the state of nature, which God has provided for all men against force and violence. So when, the government's not fulfilling its role in the protection of property, protection of rights, acting for majority rule, then it justifiable civil disobedience or maybe even revolt. So when the legislative transgresses that fundamental role of society, either by ambition, fear, folly, or corruption, and endeavor to grasp for themselves their private interests, right? Or to put the hands of another in absolute power over the lives, liberties, and estates of the people, by which this breach of trust for forfeit the power the people had put into the hands of it for quite contrary ends. So it's popular sovereignty. You are imbued with political authority in virtue of the will of the people. When you stop behaving for the will of the people, then we got a good reason to reject it. So we can come up with a nice little chart here, some key points of compare and contrast according to Hobbes and Locke. So state of nature, Hobbes, short, nasty, and brutish. It's pessimistic, and there is no morality. We live in fear of constant violent death. Locke's classical liberalism, we have inalienable rights to the life, liberty, and property in pursuit of happiness. We enter into the social agreement or the compact according to Hobbes out of rational self-interest and self-preservation because we're peace-seeking. In Locke, we're peace-seeking, and it's easier to preserve ourselves, but we also get independent judges to several controversies in common law. With regard to political authority, Hobbes, we got that near absolute monarchy of the sovereign, capital S there, versus popular sovereignty, right? Justice, the sovereign's will decides what is and isn't just. Justice, according to Locke, is acting in majority rule and preservation of individual rights. So again, two different flavors of modern social contract theory. Anybody have any questions about them? Right. So again, how you start off, how you understand the state of nature is going to influence all this other stuff. So whatever assumptions you're making about human nature or what really motivates people is going to influence what your political philosophy looks like and what your view of legitimate authority looks like. So a couple of different ways of trying to come up with a social contract argument. One way is we could think about the prisoner's dilemma, which is about, again, self-interest and cooperation with others, but ones you can't communicate with. So how could we coordinate our behavior if we're not if we don't know each other to get the best result for the most people, right? So suppose you live there's that version of the prisoner's dilemma. So suppose you live in a totalitarian society, and one day, to your astonishment, you are arrested and charged with treason. The police say that you have been plotting against the government with a man named Smith, who has also been arrested and is being held in a separate cell. The interrogator demands that you confess. You protest your innocence. You don't even know Smith, but this does no good. It soon becomes clear that your captors are not interested in the truth. They merely want to convict someone. They offer you the following deal. If Smith does not confess, which means testifying against the other person and cooperating with the police, but you confess and testify against him, they'll release you. You'll go free, whereas Smith, who did not cooperate, will be put away for 10 years. Cooperate with the authorities. Smith confesses and you do not. The situation is reversed. He will go free while you get 10 years. If you both confess, you'll each be sentenced to 5 years. If neither of you confess, there won't be enough evidence to convict either of you. They can hold you for another year, but then they'll have to let both of you go. And finally, you're told that Smith is being offered the same deal, but you can't communicate with him. And you have no way of knowing what he will do. Will you confess? Will you cooperate with the cops and testify against the other person to get off? What's in your rational self-interest to do? To get at least what? Yeah, or the least amount of jail time, right? The most freedom, least amount of jail time. So let's see how y'all answered that one. 18 people said, yes, I'll confess and testify against Smith. 17 people said that they would not confess, they'd remain silent. 4 people said, I don't know. If we all did what the majority vote was, how do we end up?
In jail?
Yeah, for how long? 5 years? When we could have done better if we'd have just been quiet. Snitches get stitches, right? Here, snitches get more jail time, right? So pursuing your rational self-interest and trying to get no time whatsoever and be, I'm gonna turn tail and, accuse him, right? But the other person is thinking that as well. So if you both do that, you end up both with 5 years rather than everybody being quiet and just getting 1 year, the least amount of time, right? So it looks like pursuing your rational self-interest on a one-off prisoner's dilemma, which they talk about multiple rounds or just a one-off, right? In the reading, looks like we end up with a non-cooperation situation, right? Between the 2 prisoners there. Then we got tragedy of the commons. This one they discussed in regard to allocating water in the lost scenario in the article for today. So let's do a little thought experiment quiz on this one here. Grab a sheet of paper, something to write with, and here's the tragedy of the commons. So picture a pasture open to all. As a rational being, each herdman seeks to maximize his gain. Explicitly or implicitly, more or less consciously, he asks, what is the utility to me, my private interest, of adding 1 more animal to my herd? Since the herdman receives all the proceeds from the sale of the additional animal, the positive utility is nearly +1. Since, however, the effects of overgrazing, we're going to the commons again, right, are shared, or the public goods, right, public resources, open to everybody. So the effects of overgrazing are shared by all the herdsmen. The negative utility for any particular decision-making herdsman is only a fraction of -1. Is it rational for each herdsman to add an additional animal to their herd to maximize their self-interest? Yes. Explain why. Your answer should demonstrate some understanding of what was said about the tragedy of the commons in the reading assignment. Regardless of how you answer, it needs to demonstrate some understanding of those points that are made in the reading. So is it rational for each herdsman to add an additional animal to their herdsman, maximize self-interest? Yes. Explain why. Give me at least a paragraph. Right? 2, no. Explain why it's not rational to do so in your view. I don't know, and explain why you're conflicted about it. So again, minimum 1 paragraph answer. Your answer needs to show some understanding of how this is going to work out and the reasoning involved to support whether it's rational to do it or to not do it, or why you're conflicted about coming down the line. Why don't you talk about your responses with your neighbors for a little bit before you answer. Just put tragedy of the commons. Today's the 15th up at the top and your name on it. So what's going to happen if everybody starts adding another animal? They talk about tragedy of the commons in the physical version of the article, in the textbook version of it, it's page 276.
So are they trying to have more animals so that they can sell more?
Yeah, they're going to get profit. And so the positive utility is more profit by nearly +1. The effects of overgrazing are shared by all the herdsmen, so the negative utility for any particular decision-making herdman is only a fraction of -1. So the rational herdsman, this is Hardin's response. The rational herdsman concludes that the only sensible course for him to pursue is to add another animal to his herd, and another. But this is the conclusion reached by each and every rational herdsman sharing the commons. Therein is the tragedy. Each man is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit in a world that is limited. Ruin is the destination towards which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in the society that believes in the freedom of the commons. Freedom in commons brings ruin to all. So it looks like pursuing self-rational interest leads to the destruction of the things that we need for our rational self-interest, right? So you get a conflict in both the prisoner's dilemma and the tragedy of the commons between what looks like my individual's rationality and like collective reasoning, right? Collective reasoning. So another way of thinking about the social contract, right? Some philosophers have tried to use the prisoner's dilemma to say this is how we could generate a principle of cooperation with each other. We should recognize that maybe at least not in one-off prisoner's dilemma, but in multiple rounds, that it only makes sense to defect or to cheat once the other person has already done it. Otherwise, everybody will end up better off than they would have otherwise at the end. You do that with the tragedy of the commons as well. Here's a contemporary Kantian philosopher, John Rawls, that proposed this way of thinking about how to form or how to erect a social contract based on a particular conception of justice. If you remember Kant, he said we have to clear everything that's merely empirical out of our moral reasoning, so otherwise we'll rig it in our own favor, right? Well, Rawls's thought experiment, The Original Position, tries to do a similar thing, right? So in the original position, you're behind this veil of ignorance, right? And then the question is, what principles of justice would we choose in that condition, right? So he says, thus we're to imagine that those who engage in social cooperation choose together in one joint act the principles which are to assign the basic rights and duties to determine the division of social benefits. That's distributive justice. This original position is understood as a purely hypothetical situation characterized so as to lead to a certain conception of justice. Among the essential features of this situation is that no one knows his place. So here's the veil of ignorance. Behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know your place in society, your class position or social status, nor does anyone know his fortune and the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence, strength, and the like. I shall even assume that the parties do not know their conceptions of the good or their special psychological propensities. The principles of justice are a choice behind a veil of ignorance. This ensures that no one is advantaged or disadvantaged in the choice of principles by the outcome of natural chance or the contingency in social circumstances. Since all are similarly situated, and no one is able to design principles to favor his particular condition, the principles of justice are the result of a fair agreement or a bargain. And then here's Rawls's conception of justice as fairness that he thinks we would pick behind the veil of ignorance. So this would be the conception of justice to organize society in our social contract. First, we get the liberty principle. So each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of basic liberties, compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for others. So if I say that I have a right to decide what religion I'm going to practice, or if I'm going to practice religion at all, that means other people have that same right. So there's the reciprocity of rights in the modern world. And again, he wants a free society, so we're going to have lots of extensive liberties about what we can do. You can think of, again, the Kantian saying, well, the limit of that liberty is going to be where we're using people as mere means, right? And then the controversy over justice as fairness comes with the second principle. It's called the difference principle, and it's got two parts to it. So he says, social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that A, they are to be of the greatest benefit to the least advantaged members of society, and offices and positions must be open to everyone under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. So it's B, what kind of redistribution of wealth would that require in order to make sure that social and economic inequalities are organized so that they help the least well off the most? That's where a bunch of debate concerns there between like Rawls's kind of liberal egalitarianism, but versus like kind of some libertarian views of justice there. So that's justice as fairness. And again, just to reiterate, depending on how you start off this in the state of nature, it's going to influence whether civil disobedience is justifiable at all, right? And again, in Hobbes, it's just when the Leviathan is failing to protect peace and order, right? But they can lie to us and manipulate us in order to preserve the peace and the order. In a Lockean society, When there are laws that are erected that are not in the will of the majority, then we could protest those laws. And if the government is, failing to provide any security at all, even in Hobbes's view, you could still revolt there. But in Locke, if they start not performing the will of the people and not protecting those individual rights, then we can withdraw and go start over and revolt. All right, questions about social contract theory? What do you got? Yeah.
So with tragedy of the commons, is the idea of it based on the assumption that eventually like those resources would be exhausted, like regardless?
Yeah, that's why, because we have limited water, for example, right? So, I mean, that's the example used in the reading, right?
So like even going back to the
allocation of water.
If like each herdsman didn't add another animal, and eventually like it'll take longer, but they'll still like overexhaust their like
resources.
property, would that still be tragedy of commons?
That's what the tragedy is.
Okay, so it's not necessarily, it doesn't matter necessarily like, if it's rushed or
It doesn't matter. The speed doesn't matter. Either way, it leads to ruin. So if I take my battery, let's see, like my spent oil out of my car and start dumping it into the commons, the sewer system, like no more crawfish if everybody does that, right? So again, pursuing my private self-interest with regard to like common resources leads to the destruction of those resources. That's why it's called the tragedy of the commons. All right, other questions, folks? Anybody got anything?